Chapter 12. Fascism and Social Revolution. What is the future of fascism? What is the future of the fight against fascism? Fascism is a historical phenomenon arising in a concrete historical situation. It is useless to discuss abstractly, as in a schoolroom, alternative social forms of fascism, democracy, dictatorship, etc., without regard to the actual situation and general line of capitalism in the present period. Fascism is the outcome of modern capitalism in crisis, of capitalism passing into the period of the proletarian revolution, when it can no longer maintain its power by the old means, but is compelled to resort to ever more violent methods for the suppression of all working-class organization, and also for the attempted authoritarian economic unification and organization of its own anarchy, in a last desperate effort to maintain its existence and master the contradictions that are rending it. More specifically, fascism is the consequence of the delay of the proletarian revolution in Western and Central Europe in the post-war period, when the whole objective situation calls for the proletarian revolution as the only final solution, and ever more visibly raises the issue of the struggle for power, but when the working class movement is not yet strong enough and ready, owing to being disorganized and paralyzed by reformism, and thus lets the initiative pass to fascism. Quote, "Fascism, as Clara Zetkin declared in 1923, is the punishment of the proletariat for failing to carry on the revolution begun in Russia." Unquote. Fascism is the abortion consequent on a miscarriage of the proletarian revolution. But fascism cannot solve the contradictions or prevent the collapse of capitalism. On the contrary, fascism carries the contradictions, both within the capitalist world and between the two worlds since 1917, the capitalist world and the socialist world, to the highest point. Fascism brings an extreme intensification of the class struggle and of the process of revolutionization. Fascist tendencies are not peculiar to the countries of completed fascist dictatorship, to Germany, Austria, and Italy, or to Poland, Hungary, etc. Fascist tendencies are common in greater or less degree to all modern capitalism, including Western Europe and America, wherever the process of decay and the advance of the class struggle have reached a certain point, and advance in proportion as working class resistance is paralyzed or weakened by reformism. I want to read that sentence again. Fascist tendencies are common in greater or less degree to all modern capitalism, including Western Europe and America, wherever the process of decay and the advance of the class struggle have reached a certain point, and advance in proportion as working class resistance is paralyzed or weakened by reformism. So commenting, that's a very important point, because people often look at this question as kind of black and white. Is this country fascist? Is that country fascist? So this is kind of more the question, does this country have a completed fascist dictatorship? And the answer to that question is not always yes. However, to the question, are some fascist tendencies found? Yes. That's the answer. Yes. The only question is to what extent, to what degree. In other words, how far has fascisation gone? This is just a product of the decay brought about by advanced monopoly capitalism or imperialism. And very important to note from this section, the reason for it is the delay of the proletarian revolution. And why does that happen? It's because the working class is paralyzed or weakened by reformism. Continuing. Section 1. The Dialectics of Fascism and Revolution. The victory of fascism in Central Europe and the advance of fascist tendencies in Western Europe and America in 1933-4 represents the highest point yet reached by the counter-revolution since the war. But this victory of the counter-revolution does not represent the growing strength of capitalism. On the contrary, it is the direct result of the extreme aggravation of the world crisis and of the instability of capitalism, of the shattering of Versailles and all the peace settlements, of the growth of social contradictions and mass discontent, bursting all peaceful and legal forms, that is to say, of the very advance of all the forces which finally make for the victory of the proletarian revolution, since the proletarian revolution alone can solve these contradictions, which fascism can only intensify. Capitalism can no longer maintain its power by the old means. The crisis is driving the whole political situation at an accelerating pace. All social and international contradictions are brought to a new and greater sharpness by the successive developments of the crisis of capitalism. All strata of the population are affected by the crisis. The bourgeois regime is driven to ever more desperate expedients to prolong for a while longer its lease of life. For the decade and a half since the war, the bourgeoisie has maintained its power, mainly on the basis of social democracy as the governing instrument to hold in the workers and prevent the working class revolution. In return for disciplining the workers and preaching myths about democracy and the, quote, peaceful path to socialism, social democracy has been given ministerial posts, patronage, and pickings. This process of being drawn into the capitalist machine has been held up to the workers as evidence of the gradual, peaceful conquest of, quote, power by the working class. How much this power was worth when it came to the test, or rather, where the real power lay, has been abundantly shown by the events in Germany, Austria, and elsewhere. But this system, or particular mechanism of capitalist rule in the post-war crisis, is not eternal, as the labor leaders, on the flood tide of Mondism and successive labor governments, have fondly hoped. The crisis drives to sharper political issues, to intensified class struggle, to the need of new forms of capitalist rule, to rapid and desperate emergency measures, the basis of widening social reforms and concessions, hastily granted in the post-war period to stave off revolution and constituting the mechanism of social democratic influence and ascendancy in the working class in the Western imperialist countries, breaks down under the strain of the economic crisis and gives place to the withdrawal and cutting down of social reforms and increasing attacks upon the workers. With this process, a new alignment of political forces develops. On the one hand, the hold of social democracy upon the workers begins to weaken, as shown in its declining numbers, its increasing use of social fascist disciplinary measures and violence, and in the growth of communist influence. In the face of this growing revolutionization of the workers, the bourgeoisie hastens to act, while there is yet time, before communism has yet won its visibly approaching majority position in the working class, while the disorganization of the workers by social democracy can still prevent successful resistance and brings into play the dangerous hazard of fascism to smash the advance of the working class. On the other hand, the working class, tied to capitalism by the reformist leadership inherited from the preceding period, is paralyzed from being able to play its decisive role as political leader in the developing crisis, and draw all the discontented strata of the population under its leadership for the overthrow of capitalism. On the contrary, since there is no standing still, the exact reverse process takes place in the early stages. As the crisis develops, the working class, under reformist leadership, appears to grow not stronger but weaker. The policy of coalition with capitalism has steadily demoralized and sapped the strength of the old working class organizations, brought membership lower and lower every year to the lowest point since the war, and destroyed the confidence of the workers in their organization and leadership. The class struggle goes forward, but in disorganized form, since the new fighting leadership has not yet won the majority of the working class, and has to fight simultaneously the forces of capitalism and the throttling stranglehold of the reformist machine. In consequence, the working class forces are weakened and divided at the very moment of the heaviest capitalist attack, not because of the militant workers who remain true to the class struggle, but because of the alliance of the reformist machine with capitalism. This weakening of the workers' forces in the face of the fascist attack is the price of the path of bourgeois pseudo-democracy, of social democracy. At the same time as the organized working class forces are thus temporarily weakened, the way is opened for alternative forces, which could otherwise play only a subordinate part, to come to the front. The mixed intermediate strata, or so-called middle classes, who can play no independent political role, but can only act in practice as the ally of either the working class or capital, come to the front, in proportion as the active role of the working class is weakened. They are sharply affected by the crisis and by all the operations of finance capital. Their lower strata are the natural ally of the working class in the war on finance capital, but they see from their point of view the modern parliamentary state as a coalition of big capital or, quote, international financiers and labor bosses, with themselves left out, and feel themselves squeezed by ever-increasing taxation for the benefit of big business and the system of social services to the workers, that is, the system of social reformism. Nor can the reformist labor propaganda, which dare not touch the roots of finance capital, expose to them the real reasons of their plight, or give them the revolutionary lead for which they are groping to mobilize them against their real enemy. Thus they become easy prey for the demagogic propaganda of finance capital to give them a sham, quote, revolutionary lead, exploiting to the full the weaknesses and corruption of laborism or social democracy, and organize them as a counterforce against the working class, in contradiction to their own interests. Capital is able for the first time to organize no longer a mere mercenary army for its support, but a mass movement built on disgust with reformism, built out of those intermediate strata and unstable, discontented, disillusioned working class elements against the organized working class. From the ruins and discredit of reformism, fascism springs. So commenting here, I was thinking of, in the 1970s, the rise of the Libertarian Party and all the other kind of pseudo-populist right-wing forms. Quoting, "They are sharply affected by the crisis and by all the operations of finance capital. From their point of view, they see the modern parliamentary state as a coalition of big capital or international financiers and labor bosses with themselves left out, and they feel themselves squeezed by taxation, etc. But as the social reformist machine cannot really expose the roots of the system to them, they become the playthings of big capital, dancing to the tune of capitalist propaganda, and they become extremely hard to reach." Continuing, "The old liberal parliamentary democratic method of maintaining bourgeois rule on a basis of social reforms increasingly breaks down before the realities of the economic crisis and the sharpening of the class struggle. On all sides, the bankruptcy of the old social, economic, and political system becomes recognized, and the demand for a complete change of the social system replaces the old cry for reforms. Capitalism has to meet this new situation in which its whole regime begins to be questioned and denounced, no longer by the few, but by the overwhelming majority of the population, and the call for, quote, socialism and, quote, revolution sounds on all sides. An extreme example of this process is revealed in Germany on the eve of fascism, where in the elections of the summer of 1932, no fewer than 74% of the voters gave their votes for parties proclaiming the aim of, quote, socialism. And all the parties which declared their support of capitalism could not win more than a quarter of the electors. In this situation, capitalism is only able to save its power for one further lease by the final desperate expedient of staging a sham, quote, revolution, with the nominal aim of, quote, socialism, but in fact designed to maintain its power, the, quote, National Socialist Revolution, or fascism. The poison, from the point of view of capitalism, of the, quote, revolutionary and, quote, socialist propaganda, which can today alone win a mass hearing, is skillfully rendered harmless by the antidote of the, quote, national idea. Thus, the final mask of this ultimate masquerade of capitalism, staging a, quote, socialist, quote, revolution, to maintain its power becomes the old national label. What is the significance of this? Does it mean that the national appeal is in fact stronger to the masses than the socialist? Not at all. The Nationalist Party in Germany, on the basis of the pure national appeal, could only win 2 million votes, where, by the skillful addition of socialism, the, quote, National Socialist Party could win 13 million. But the national label becomes the final device for distorting and defeating the meaning of socialism, when the defense of capitalism can no longer be openly proclaimed. The whole drive of the present situation, as all are increasingly compelled to recognize, is toward the necessity and inevitability of collective social organization, that is, toward socialism. The, quote, national principle, on the other hand, represents in reality the rule of a given capitalist grouping in opposition to other capitalist groupings. But the national principle is falsely presented to appear as the expression of the collective social principle against private egoism, individualism, capitalism. In this way, the historical movement toward collective social organization, when it becomes too strong to be any longer directly resisted, is attempted to be distorted from its common human basis into an exclusive group assertive basis, which becomes in fact the cover for the maintenance of the rule of the capitalist class. This is the significance of, quote, National Socialism or fascism. But what is the historical outcome of this process? The advance to fascism as the final defense means the destruction of legality, not by the revolutionaries, but by the bourgeoisie, and the laying bare to all of the class struggle as a direct conflict of force. Comment here. So we talk in a number of ways about capitalism being its own gravedigger. First of all, by creating the proletariat, which it needs to enrich itself, but which eventually realizes it has no interest in seeing the continuation of capitalism, and that it has the strength and means, under certain conditions of organizing, to end it. But here's a more specific case, where capitalism, in order to maintain its rule, starts tearing apart its own system of law. This gives those who believe in the system less and less to hold on to, and it becomes clearer and clearer, more and more exposed, that in the end, capitalism is one class oppressing and exploiting the other for the enrichment of itself by any means necessary, including just all-out brute force if it comes down to that. And under those circumstances, it becomes easier for more and more average people to think, this has become a nightmare, we have less and less to lose, why not fight back? were already in a state of open conflict. Continuing, in order to hold off the revolution, the bourgeoisie is compelled to play at revolution and to seek to, quote, outbid the revolution. They are compelled to preach to the masses contempt for peace and legality, which were formerly their best protection. To prevent the working class revolution, they are compelled to stage their masquerade revolution and even to dub it a socialist revolution. The Junkers, barons, and industrial magnates, in order to maintain their power, are compelled to place themselves at the head of bandit hordes with cries of down with interest capital, down with unearned income, nationalization of the trusts, nationalization of the banks, socialization of all enterprises ripe for socialization, etc. The modern Black Hundreds, comment extreme reactionaries, have to proclaim themselves, quote, socialists and enemies of, quote, capitalism in order to win a hearing and save capitalism. Such is the measure of the strength of capitalism revealed in the temporary victory of the fascist counter-revolution. It is manifest that we have here not a strengthening, but in reality and in the final outcome, an extreme weakening of capitalism. The further examination of the development of the fight against fascism will reveal the inevitable final working out of the dialectics of this process. Section 2. The fight against fascism. What then of the future of the fight against fascism? Fascism, it is evident from the above analysis, develops out of the decay of bourgeois democracy and reformism in the conditions of the capitalist crisis. Indeed, fascism develops in the first place in and through the forms of bourgeois democracy, step by step strengthening the state coercive apparatus and emergency powers, and restricting the rights of the workers, in proportion as the workers' resistance is paralyzed by reformism and trust in constitutionalism, and only when the ground has been thus fully prepared within the shell of democracy, and the workers' forces disorganized to the maximum, only then the final blow is struck, and the complete and open fascist dictatorship is established. Germany and Austria are the outstanding examples of this process, where all the preliminary stages for the victory of fascism were carried through by a Brüning or Adolphus in the name of the defense of the, quote, Constitution, and with the support of the social democratic leadership on this basis. In consequence, the fight against fascism cannot be conducted on the basis of trusting to bourgeois, quote, democracy as the defense against fascism. To do this means to invite and to guarantee the victory of fascism. The fight against fascism can only be conducted on the basis of the united class fight of the workers, leading all the exploited strata against all the attacks of finance capital. Whether these attacks are conducted through nominal, quote, democratic forms or through open fascist forms. The stronger the fight of the workers in the early stages, within these still nominally maintained, quote, democratic forms, the less easy becomes the advance of the bourgeoisie to the further stages, to the open fascist forms. Hence the importance of the united working class front. The strength of the working class fight is also decisive for winning the wavering petty bourgeois sections. The bourgeois democrats and reformists argue that fascism is the consequence of communism. Quote, the fear of the dictatorship of the working class has evoked the iron dictatorship of capitalism and nationalism. Reaction on the right has bred reaction on the left. Reaction of the left is displaced by triumphant reaction of the right. This is quoting the Labor Manifesto on Democracy versus Dictatorship, March 1933. From this, they draw the conclusion, expressed in many labor speeches, quote, to defeat fascism, root out communism. Wow. So, cue the Naked Gun forehead slapping scene. I mean, that is as backward as you could possibly get it. Continuing, this line is expressed in the abstract slogan, democracy versus dictatorship, presented without reference to class relations. That is, in practice, defense of the existing capitalist state, with its increasing fascist tendencies, against the working class revolution under cover of the plea of defense against the fascist danger. Wow. This line of the Labour Party is also the line of the big bourgeoisie in its present propaganda. Thus, the conservative leader, Baldwin, declared in a speech at Glasgow on June 24, 1932, quote, in Europe, you find these communistic methods were tried in Italy. What was the result? Something very near civil war, when the right beat the left, and you got a dictatorship, not of the left, but of the right. I say that a dictatorship of no kind will we have in this country, either of the right or of the left, at any time, unquote. What is important here is not the glaring travesty of the actual facts, namely that in Italy the communists were in a minority, that the reformist socialists in Italy were defeated not because they adopted communist methods, but because they specifically refused to adopt communist methods, because they refused to seize power in 1920, when by the admission of all it was theirs for the taking, because they clung to passive parliamentary and industrial strike tactics, and therefore fascism conquered, and that finally, the only country where the working class has adopted communist methods, the Soviet Union, is the only country where fascism has not been able to show its face. All this has been long demonstrated by history, and the conservative plus labor propagandists are only hoping to play on the ignorance of their hearers when they thus endeavor to conceal the real facts. But what is here important is the exact unity, even to a literal identity of phrasing, revealed between the line of the Labour Party and the line of the Conservative Party, that is, of the ruling party of the bourgeoisie. This identity should already awaken the alertness of any working-class supporter of the Labour Party to the fact that the line here expressed represents no defense of working-class interests or of a real fight against fascism. The whole dialectics of revolution and counter-revolution, of vital importance for the understanding of the present period, lies concealed and distorted behind this treatment. The conception of communism as the cause of fascism is as shallow in understanding of the real working of social forces as it is illusory in fact. The growth of the working class revolution, or communism, and the growth of violent capitalist repression are in reality both equally the consequence and outcome and expression of the growing crisis and breakup of capitalism. They develop as parallel parts of the single process of the gathering revolutionary crisis. To find in one symptom the cause of the other symptom is worthy of the shallowest quack. In fact, the example of Austria, where the Communist Party was still very weak, and where social democracy boasted of the completeness of its control of the working class, has shown how little the bourgeoisie has need of the pretext of communism to advance to the fascist dictatorship. Quote, "Before the war," declared Lenin in his speech to the All-Russian Conference of the Bolshevik Party, May 1917, "England was the freest country in the world. There was freedom in England because there was no revolutionary movement there." Unquote. Does this mean that the masses in pre-war England were fortunate because they had no revolutionary movement? On the contrary, the formal, quote, freedom was only the mirror, the counterpart of the real subjection. The, quote, freedom was conditional on the masses passively accepting their servitude and looking only for the crumbs of reforms. But so soon as the workers began to stir against their servitude and to fight consciously for their liberation, the, quote, freedom rapidly disappears and gives place to the whip. Commenting, in other words, they don't need the whip when you're already obeying them. Sometimes they use it anyway, but they don't need it in the same way. Continuing, and that is the meaning of fascism. Fascism marks the extreme intensification of the capitalist dictatorship and offensive against the working class. But it marks thereby, at the same time, the growth of capitalist contradictions and the growth of the revolutionary awakening of the working class. So commenting, again, the capitalists don't necessarily need to violently intervene when you're already basically staying in your lane. But why do people more and more start getting out of that lane that the capitalists have assigned to us? Well, partly the breakdown of their system, which is inevitable. Not because just some rabble-rousers came along. I mean, certainly some people have more agitational and propaganda ability, but that agitation still has to refer to actual events, actual social processes, in order for it to gain any traction. Continuing, if today in England and the other Western countries the traditional, quote, freedoms are being steadily eaten into and cut down, if police expenditure has tripled since the war and the police are being centralized and militarized, if freedom of agitation and assembly and demonstration is being more and more cut away, if the trade union machine on top is absorbed into unity with capitalism and the state, and the price of criticism of labor leaders is assessed at £7,000 by the capitalist courts, all this is only a measure of the awakening of the working class. The awakening of the working class pricks the myth of freedom and lays bare the lash of the despot. The degree of violence, the degree of coercion and restriction of rights, the variation of methods between open, complete fascism and partial developing forms of fascism beneath a decaying pseudo-democratic cover corresponds to the degree of development of the working class and of the relations of the class struggle. Does this mean that so long as the forms of bourgeois democracy remain, bourgeois democracy provides the best defense of the workers against fascism? Just here it is necessary to see with absolute clearness the real conditions of the struggle against fascism. The workers fight, and need to fight, tenaciously for every democratic right of organization and of agitation within the existing regime. Against the attack of fascism on bourgeois democracy, the workers will fight to defend bourgeois democratic liberties. But they cannot afford for one moment to be blind to the fact that bourgeois democracy is only a cover for the capitalist dictatorship, and that within its forms, the advance to fascism is steadily pushed forward. So commenting, we've talked about this idea of bourgeois civil liberties before. Lenin wrote about this topic, and so we've discussed it in some of the Lenin audiobooks. But basically, we do want to preserve bourgeois civil liberties as much as we can, insofar as they create better, easier conditions for waging the class struggle. Everything ultimately comes down to that. Whatever's going to make that easier, we want to do it. But we also have to recognize that system doesn't belong to us, and the bourgeoisie actually uses it as a cover for building fascism underneath the surface. So preserving those liberties isn't the end in itself. They are a means to the end of a socialist revolution. And a socialist revolution can still be done in the absence of a high degree of bourgeois civil liberties. However, anything that can get the cops and courts off of your back may give you an easier time in doing whatever it is you need to do. And ultimately, when that is done and we're building socialism, we can far exceed whatever freedoms were granted under capitalism. Continuing. Bourgeois democracy breeds fascism. Fascism grows organically out of bourgeois democracy. At what point did Dollfuss, the quote, champion of democracy in Europe, become Dollfuss, champion of fascism? The process developed through such a series of stages that up to the very last, social democracy was offering alliance to Dollfuss to, quote, save the Constitution, at the same time as Dollfuss was proclaiming the complete principles of fascism and preparing to turn his guns upon the workers. The more the workers placed their trust in legalism, in constitutionalism, in bourgeois democracy, the more they make sacrifices to save the existing regime as the, quote, lesser evil against the menace of fascism, the heavier become the capitalist attacks and the more rapid the advance to fascism. To preach confidence in legalism, in constitutionalism, in bourgeois democracy, that is, in the capitalist state, means to invite and to guarantee the victory of fascism. That is the lesson of Germany and of Austria. And this is the reality which blows to smithereens the deceitful and disastrous slogan of democracy versus dictatorship. Yet, in the face of the deadly lessons of Germany and of Austria, the British Labour Party leadership and social democracy in Western Europe are today repeating to the last detail the fatal line of German social democracy. All that German social democracy and the German trade unions preached and practiced, the British Labour Party and the British trade unions are preaching and practicing today. How then can they expect the same policy to lead to a different outcome? They preach up and down the country in favor of democracy and constitutionalism and legality. So did German social democracy. They denounce communism. They refuse the United Front. They expel all militant workers. They set up a network of discipline to maintain the safety of their organizations for capitalism. So did German social democracy. They are faithful pillars of capitalism and of imperialism. So was German social democracy. They are treading the same road. Only the action of the workers, learning their lessons in time, refusing to follow their teaching, breaking their bands and building up the common front against capitalism, can change the outcome. What have they to offer the workers if their policy leads to the same outcome as confronted German social democracy? Nothing. What is their answer? They have no answer. Citrine, leader of British trade unionism, speaking of the Trades Union Congress in September 1933 on the situation that confronted German social democracy, could only say, "I hope to God we are never put into a similar position. I hope we never have to face that position." And again, with regard to the growth of mass unemployment as the visible common factor both in Britain and in Germany, quote, "If that gets worse, I cannot answer for the consequences," unquote. Hope to God cannot answer. Such is the final lead of British labourism in the face of fascism. Of one thing only, Citrine is sure: it is impossible to fight. If it comes to a fight, the workers will be beaten. Quote, "If we go in for the method of force, we shall be badly beaten." And again, quote, "If we try to organize by force of arms, we shall be beaten." Unquote. We shall be beaten. We shall be badly beaten. Such is the litany of defeat before the battle, by which the reformist leaders seek to drill into the workers the sense of their own impotence. This is the open invitation to capitalism to launch the attack on the workers' organizations. The workers are defenseless and cannot resist. Social democracy, as the chairman of the Trades Union Congress declared on the same occasion, is, quote, "peaceful, law-abiding, and shrinks from fratricidal conflict," unquote, and therefore is inevitably, as he finds, at the mercy of its bloodthirsty enemies, quote, One of the tragic lessons of events in Germany was that the enemies of democracy were willing to shed blood to destroy liberty, and did not shrink from murder, arson, and lawless action. But social democracy was peaceful, law-abiding, and shrank from fratricidal strife." Unquote. The very heart of reformism is here laid bare. Capitalism is all-powerful. The workers are powerless against it. The workers must only hope to get what capitalism permits them through the legal forms that capitalism permits. Let us cling to what capitalism may grant us through the forms of, quote, democracy, which in fact were only won by violent struggle, and, quote, hope to God that if we are docile, capitalism may not strike us further. Such is the voice of the beaten, trembling slave, which expresses itself as the philosophy of reformism. Does then the advance of fascism mean the end of all things? That there is no hope for the working class movement? That there is no hope for the victory of socialism? On the contrary, the poet William Morris, in his imaginative picture, already quoted, of the path of the socialist revolution in England, in the chapter How the Change Came, of News from Nowhere, describes how the government proclaimed martial law and appointed a well-known general who, with modern artillery, carried through a terrible massacre of thousands of unarmed workers. The following dialogue then ensues between the narrator and his informant, Old Hammond, quote, "I wondered that he should have gotten so elated about a mere massacre, and I said, 'How fearful!' And I suppose that this massacre put an end to the whole revolution for that time?" "No, no," cried Old Hammond. "It began it. That massacre began the Civil War." Unquote. It began the Civil War. It destroyed the myths and illusions of legality and passive slavery, and laid bare the Civil War which, once begun, could only finally end with the victory of the masses. And that, above all, is the significance of fascism. The old poet is 100 times right against the trembling modern reformists, who solemnly declare that modern artillery and technique have made revolution impossible. Once the myths and illusions of legality and pacifism have fallen, once the united mass of the workers enter into the struggle, with the scales fallen from their eyes, there is no question of the ultimate outcome. The exploiters know this well, hence their anxiety to build up the final rampart of a national fascist ideology of deception in the masses, alongside the direct violence and coercion, and hence also the importance on the workers' side of carrying through the ideological political fight of exposure against fascism, alongside the direct preparation of the mass struggle and final armed struggle. The example of Austria has shown how much even a courageous minority of the workers, shackled and held back at every point by their reformist leaders, when all the previous favorable opportunities had been squandered and the enemy had been allowed to entrench himself over the whole field before the struggle began, when the great part of the mass organizations of the workers were directly held back from the struggle by their chiefs, could nevertheless accomplish to shake and bring to a critical position the whole fascist regime and awaken an answering spirit of struggle throughout the whole world. The bands of hundreds of Schutzbündler who fought their way to freedom across the frontier are reported to have cried out as they reached the other side, "Long live the Soviet Union," and some, "Long live the Communist International." Their lesson was learned. How much more will the final outcome of the struggle be certain when the whole working class will fight as a united force under revolutionary leadership, when fascism will be weakened and disorganized by its own internal contradictions and by the fiasco of its regime and of its promises, and when disillusionment and discontent and rising sympathy with their fighting working class brothers will spread through the lower fascist ranks. Tsarism also fell despite all its machinery of repression. Far more certainly and rapidly will the card castles of the modern fascist dictatorships fall when the time comes. The laying bare of the Civil War at the root of class society, the explosion of all the illusions of peace and legality, that is, above all, the historical role of fascism. Fascism attempts to organize society on the basis of permanent civil war, no longer merely with the old state forces, police and military, of repression, but with permanent special armed legions of class war to hold down the workers. That fact is the most complete expression of the final bankruptcy of capitalism and of the certainty of its collapse. The eyes of all are being opened to the realities of class society and to the real character of the war confronting the working class. The necessity of the workers' dictatorship as the sole means to crush the counter-revolution is becoming understood. The crisis within the post-war Second International since fascism in Germany is only the expression of this process. As we enter more and more directly into a period of revolutionary conditions, when the working class movement can only be carried forward by revolutionary methods and under illegal conditions or go under, the will-o'-the-wisp lights of so-called democratic socialism, that is, of socialism by permission of the bourgeoisie, that's good, inevitably go into eclipse and leave the workers in the bog. Only the clear light of revolutionary socialism burns stronger than ever and shows the path forward. The issue becomes more and more clearly no longer even in appearance a question of two tendencies, of two paths for the working class struggle. In the sight of all, the Communist International alone leads the working class struggle. In this situation, even the Second International was compelled in form to recognize the necessity of, quote, revolutionary methods, and the, quote, error of its past policies. German social democracy, in its latest executive manifesto of January 1934, proclaims the, quote, error of its path in 1918. Quote, the political transformation of 1918 ended up in a counter-revolutionary development. The Social Democratic Party took over control of the state without opposition, sharing it as a matter of course with the bourgeois parties, the old bureaucracy, and even with the reorganized military forces. That it should have taken over the old machinery of government virtually unchanged was the great historical error committed by a German labor movement which had lost its sense of direction during the war, unquote. The great historical error. 15 years ago, the center of controversy of the Second and Third Internationals, expressed in the controversy of Kautsky and Lenin. And commenting, if you're not familiar with that, read Lenin's book, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Kautsky at one time was a good Marxist and then became renegade. We have that on the channel, and it's in the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide playlist. Continuing, turned precisely on this point, when Lenin, with Marx, declared that it was necessary for the workers' revolution not to take over, but to smash the existing capitalist state machine and establish its own dictatorship instead, and the Second International denied this. Now, 15 years too late, after the harm is done, after the German working class is reduced to the uttermost limit of subjection by their methods, the Second International blandly proclaims that its policy was a, quote, error, and then proceeds again, in fact, to recommend the path of bourgeois democracy. Quote, the new organization of the state on the basis of freedom by the convening of a national assembly elected by universal, equal, direct, and secret suffrage, unquote. Once again, despite all the attempts to make a show of a great change of heart, this is in reality the old Weimar path. But the German workers have had their experience of the Weimar path and its outcome, and have no intention to repeat it. Similarly, the Second International, in its Paris Resolution of August 1933, on the strategy and tactics of the international labor movement during the period of fascist reaction, admits the necessity of, quote, revolutionary struggle after fascism, quote, where the bourgeoisie has renounced democracy in order to throw itself into the arms of fascism, and has deprived the working class of the democratic means of struggle, the only means of emancipation left is that of the revolutionary struggle. In the countries in which fascism has prevailed, the dictatorship can only be overthrown by a revolution of the people. When they have gained their victory over fascism, the revolutionary forces will not confine themselves to breaking its power. They will destroy the great capitalist and landowning forces, which are its economic foundation, unquote. By this declaration, the whole line of the 1918 revolution, of Weimar democracy, is implicitly condemned. In the controversy of those days between Kautsky and Lenin, between the line that the revolutionary working class, in the moment of victorious overthrow of the old regime, must confine itself to setting up, quote, pure democracy, and then await a majority in the Constituent Assembly or Parliament before proceeding further, and the line that the revolutionary working class in the moment of victory must at once use its power, without waiting for parliamentary majorities, to overthrow capitalism, the Second International is now compelled, 15 years late, in a half-hidden, unclear fashion, to admit that Lenin was right. The revolutionary working class, it is now declared, in the moment of overthrow of the old regime must at once, without waiting for constituent assemblies or parliamentary majorities, proceed to, quote, destroy the great capitalist and landowning forces. Excellent. If this were seriously meant, it would mean the workers' dictatorship. But in fact this phrase, thrown in as a sop because in relation to Germany today, it would be impossible openly to advocate the return to the completely exposed Weimar democracy, is used as a fine-sounding phrase without any attempt to face what it practically involves, and is made completely meaningless by the rest of the resolution. Further, notable precaution, it is to be applied only to countries where fascism has already conquered. What therefore does this line mean in practice? First, the working class must let itself be bulldozed by democracy, paralyzed and divided by reformism, smashed and butchered by fascism. Then, when their forces have been thus heavily broken up and weakened, When fascism has completely organized and established without resistance its apparatus of armed Praetorian guards over the disarmed workers, then the workers are graciously permitted by the Second International to carry through the socialist revolution. Though, if there were the slightest signs appearing of their succeeding in this, these gentlemen, as the Karlsbad Manifesto of German social democracy has made clear, would be the first to hurry forward to wave again the banner of pure democracy, and thus endeavor again to save the bourgeoisie, as in 1918. But where, quote, democracy still exists, the workers must still tread the fatal path of pure democracy, abstaining from any revolutionary initiative until fascism has conquered them. Such are the final confusions and contortions of the leadership of the Second International in the present epoch. Against this line, the revolutionary working class line of communism declares the workers' dictatorship is the only alternative to the capitalist dictatorship, which at present is increasingly passing from the older, quote, democratic to fascist forms. The workers' dictatorship is the only guarantee against the victory of fascism, against the victory of the capitalist counter-revolution, and the unlimited subjection of the working class. The path of bourgeois democracy ends in fascism. The battle for the workers' dictatorship must be fought, not merely after fascism, but before fascism, as the sole means to prevent fascism. Social democracy says, first fascism, then revolution. But communism says, revolution before fascism and preventing fascism. Fascism is not inevitable. Fascism only becomes inevitable if the working class line follows the line of reformism, of trust in the capitalist state, of refusal of the united front, and thus lets itself be struck down by the class enemy. But if the working class follows the line of the united front, of the rising mass struggle, of the building of its communist party and fighting mass organization to the final victory of the revolution and establishment of the workers' dictatorship, then the working class can defeat and crush fascism and pass straight to the socialist order with no costly and shameful fascist interlude. This is the path to defeat fascism. Equally in those countries where the fascist dictatorship has won the temporary upper hand, the only path forward, an object of the workers' struggle, requires to be no longer the restoration of the old illusory, quote, democracy, which prepared the way for fascism, but the workers' dictatorship and the establishment of the Soviet regime. The German working class revolution is not defeated, despite the temporary retreat of 1933 made inevitable by the whole role of social democracy. On the contrary, Germany is nearer to the final victory of the proletarian revolution than any country in the capitalist world. The fact that the German workers are going through the extremist hell of fascism is the reflection of the fact not that their movement is more backward, but that it is relatively more advanced and closer to the revolution. The liberals and reformists see only the surface completeness of the fascist victory. They can never understand the dialectical process. They see the immediate victory of fascism, but they do not see the negative side. They do not see the disintegration of all capitalist stability that represents. They do not see the very ferocity of the capitalist attack is the measure of the growing revolutionary advance. They do not see the significance of the crushing exposure of the line of reformism and laying bare of the real battle. They do not see that the Communist Party of Germany, with unbroken ranks and organization, and over 100,000 members active under the most extreme terror, a record without parallel in working class history, is in reality stronger than it has ever been, closer to the winning of the unquestioned leadership of the majority of the working class, closer to the victory of the proletarian revolution. The mournful pessimists and faint-hearts who see a long period of fascist dictatorship and unshaken reaction in front do not understand the whole character of the present period of the destruction of capitalist stability, a period in which rapid changes throughout the world and gigantic revolutionary struggles are before us. The bourgeoisie dreamed through fascism to exterminate Marxism, that is, to exterminate the independent working class movement and the fight for socialism. The attempt is not a new one. 100 years ago, quote, all the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise the specter of communism. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies, unquote. The collapse of 1848 was heralded as the collapse of socialism. In the decade after the Commune, on the basis of 30,000 corpses, Thiers boasted that, we have heard the last of socialism. In the following decade, Bismarck set himself to stamp out Marxism in Germany with all the power of the most highly organized Prussian police and bureaucratic system, and after 12 years had to recognize that he had met his master. Down the long gallery of the years, the ghosts of the past, Cavaignac and Galifet, Thiers and Bismarck, Pobedonostsev and Stolypin, Kornilov and Kolchak, the hangmen and butchers and jailers of bourgeois rule, may welcome with a spectral sneer the new accessions to their ranks. Hitler and Goering and Goebbels, taking their place alongside Horthy and Sankov and Dyer and Chiang Kai-shek. But the older attempts were against a still early and newly rising movement. Today the attempt is against a powerful and developed movement on the eve of power. That it will fail, like every previous attempt, and end in ignominious collapse requires no demonstration. Quoting Marx's The Civil War in France, wherever, in whatever shape, and under whatever conditions the class struggle obtains any consistency, it is but natural that members of our association should stand in the foreground. The soil out of which it grows is modern society itself. It cannot be stamped out by any amount of carnage. To stamp it out, the government would have to stamp out the despotism of capital over labor, the condition of their own parasitical existence." Unquote. What is in question now is not the inevitable future collapse of fascism. What matters now is the speed with which the international working class can gather its forces and drive back this offensive before it has developed further, before it has developed to the point of world war and the direct attack on the Soviet Union, can prevent the enormous losses and sacrifices which a prolongation of this struggle will mean, and can rapidly transform the present situation into the revolutionary offensive. The issues which are confronting the world at the present moment are heavy issues. Fascism in Germany lays bare to all where capitalist civilization is inevitably developing if the workers' revolution is delayed. Germany is not a backward country. Germany is the most advanced, highly organized capitalist country in the world, the last word, which shows to other countries the picture of their future development. What is the picture of the future of capitalism thus revealed? Barbarism and the return of the Dark Ages, the systematic destruction of all science and culture, the enthronement of Catholic Christian and even pre-Christian obscurantism, racial persecution and torture systems, the tendency to a system of isolated, self-sufficient warring communities. This is the typical line of direction today of the most advanced capitalism, with the Pope conferring his blessing upon it and decorating the murderer Goering with his Medal of the Holy Year. Marx and Engels long ago pointed out the inevitable working out of capitalism in barbarism and decay if the working class revolution should fail to conquer in time. Stage by stage, through imperialism and its world orgies of brutality and destruction, through the slaughter of the World War, and today through fascism, we are tasting the first beginnings of this alternative. It is time to end this chapter of human history, before we have to tread this path still further and to open the new one throughout the world, which has already begun over 1/6 of the world. Only the working class revolution can save humanity, can carry humanity forward, can organize the enormous powers of production that lie ready to hand. The working class movement in the first period after the war was not yet ready outside Russia for its world historic task. The organized working class movement was still soaked with reformist and pacifist illusions, with opportunism and corruption in its upper strata. Fascism is not only the punishment of history for this weakness, fascism is the weapon of history for purging and burning out this weakness. In the fires of fascist terror and of the fight against fascism, the revolutionary working class is drawing close its ranks, steeled and hardened and clear-seeing for the final struggle. And the revolutionary working class, thus steeled and strengthened, will rise to the height of its task and win and save the world. Whatever the black hells of suffering and destruction that have still to be passed through, we face the future with the certainty and confidence of approaching power, with contempt for the barbarous antics of the doomed and decaying parasite class enemy and its final misshapen progeny of fascism, with singing hearts and glowing confidence in the future. The last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race.